The night sky over Entebbe was silent, but something unseen was moving beneath it. A convoy of Israeli C-130s sliced through the African darkness, flying low and radio silent. The world believed this was just another hostage crisis. In reality, it was the latest secret story 2 decades in the making. A story that began not in the skies, but in the shadows of Africa's independence wars, where the Mossad had quietly planted its first roots. Before I dive into the story, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? While you are here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. From the very beginning, Israel understood that Africa was more than a distant continent. It was a battlefield of ideas and loyalties. The 1950s and 60s brought a wave of liberation movements from Accra to Addis Ababa. Empires fell, flags changed, and in the middle of this transformation stood the Cold War superpowers, Washington and Moscow, each hunting for new allies among the newly independent African states. But there was also a third player, silent and strategic. Israel, using its intelligence service, Mossad, to carve a place in Africa's future. To Tel Aviv's leadership, the mission was existential. Surrounded by hostile Arab states, Israel sought diplomatic recognition wherever it could find it. Africa, with its rising nations, represented both opportunity and danger. Fertile ground where Arab and Soviet influence could quickly grow. If Cairo or Damascus succeeded in convincing Africa that Israel was a colonial outpost, the nation's global isolation would deepen. So Mossad went to work. Under the cover of agricultural advisors, technical experts, and development missions, hundreds of Mossad officers were dispatched across the continent. They arrived in Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Zaire, offering training, technology, and promises of partnership. On paper, these were development programs. In reality, they were intelligence networks designed to collect information, shape alliances, and counteract Arab propaganda. One Mossad file, now declassified, describes the African campaign as a bridge of survival. Israeli instructors trained police units, advised presidential guards, and taught counterinsurgency tactics. Every diplomatic mission doubled as an intelligence post. The Mossad's strength was its subtlety. It didn't seek to dominate Africa, but to embed itself within it. While the CIA and KGB competed in plain sight, Mossad operated in whispers. In Ethiopia, the alliance ran deep. Emperor Haile Selassie, wary of Arab encirclement, allowed Israeli advisors to help modernize his army and build a counter-espionage branch inside his security services. In return, Israel secured access to the Red Sea, a crucial strategic corridor leading toward the Arabian Peninsula. What appeared as a partnership of convenience became one of shared survival. It was from Ethiopian soil that Mossad began its earliest monitoring of Arab military communications across the region. But this covert diplomacy wasn't always smooth. In Uganda, Mossad's presence was both valued and resented. Early on, Israel helped train Idi Amin's paratroopers and air force, believing him to be a loyal ally. Mossad instructors taught Ugandan pilots, built command centers, and supplied equipment under the radar of international observers. For a time, it seemed Israel had secured a new friend in East Africa. Then came the betrayal. By the early 1970s, Amin turned against his Israeli patrons, embracing Muammar Gaddafi and the Palestinian cause. Mossad's intelligence forewarned Tel Aviv that Amin was growing unpredictable. Reports spoke of his lavish lifestyle, paranoia, and erratic anti-Israeli statements. But the switch came abruptly. Israeli diplomats and advisors were expelled overnight. Many barely escaped Kampala alive, burning code books and destroying communications gear before boarding the last flight out. Uganda transformed from an ally into a forward base for anti-Israeli operations, hosting Palestinian militants and Libyan operatives. That experience taught Mossad two lessons. Africa's politics were fluid, and loyalty was a temporary currency. Yet, rather than retreat, Mossad doubled down, shifting its attention to Kenya, Ethiopia, and Zaire, where it found more stable partnerships. In Kenya, Israeli advisors helped establish the National Intelligence Agency during the early post-colonial years. Nairobi soon became a discreet listening post for the entire region, monitoring communications from the Red Sea, Sudan, and even parts of the Arabian coast. The cooperation was so close that decades later, during the Entebbe raid, Kenya quietly allowed Israeli aircraft to refuel on its soil, a small but decisive gesture that saved the mission. Meanwhile, Mossad quietly cultivated influence in Zaire, now the DR Congo, under the authoritarian rule of Mobutu Sese Seko. The dictator saw in Israel a mirror of his own survivalist instincts, small, surrounded, and cunning. Mossad assisted Mobutu's intelligence operatives in detecting internal threats, and in exchange, Israel gained access to the Congo's intelligence on Arab movements in Central Africa. Officially, Israel had only agricultural programs there. Unofficially, those agronomists carried cameras and transmitters rather than plows. The early 1960s also saw Mossad engage in humanitarian espionage, missions that blended moral imperatives with intelligence objectives. The agency helped rescue endangered Jewish communities scattered across Africa, particularly in Ethiopia and the Sudanese borderlands. These operations weren't just about faith. They were part of Israel's broader strategy to win hearts and information simultaneously. By saving people, they earned trust, and that trust opened new channels of intelligence flow. But Mossad wasn't alone in Africa's clandestine struggle. The KGB was training liberation armies in Angola and Mozambique. Arab intelligence services, backed by Egypt and Libya, were running their own operations to counter Israeli influence, offering scholarships, weapons, and oil money to African regimes. Africa became an invisible battlefield where ideologies clashed without headlines. Despite the rivalry, Mossad's African chapter also produced moral dilemmas. Some operations skirted legality. Others blurred the line between defense and interference. There were moments when Mossad's pursuit of survival meant supporting regimes later condemned for human rights abuses. Yet in Tel Aviv's calculus, geopolitical necessity outweighed ethics. Every friendly government in Africa meant one less vote against Israel at the United Nations. By the late 1960s, Israel's African strategy was paying off. Over 30 nations had diplomatic ties with Tel Aviv, more than with any other non-African state. Mossad's presence expanded quietly, not as conquerors, but as shadow partners. Training programs in intelligence analysis and communications encryption popped up under civilian guises. Dozens of African leaders secretly visited Israel for security consultations, their trips unrecorded by official media. The continent's intelligence community was slowly shaped by Israeli methodology, emphasizing agility, deception, and layered secrecy. Still, every success planted a seed of danger. Arab states grew increasingly alarmed by Israel's reach. Libya's Gaddafi poured money into counterintelligence networks aimed at exposing Mossad cells. Sudan became a corridor for arms transfers to Palestinian factions, while Egyptian operatives tried to turn African officers against their Israeli contacts. Mossad found itself hunted by the very environment it had once controlled, and yet the agency thrived under pressure. One internal report described Africa as a rehearsal ground for global operations. It was there that Mossad refined techniques later used in Europe and the Middle East: the use of deep cover agents, false diplomatic credentials, and front companies to disguise intelligence activities. Africa was both a school and a testing ground. Behind the curtain, Israel's broader foreign policy engine, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Defense Ministry, and the intelligence community worked in tight coordination. Every development project carried an intelligence dimension. When Israeli engineers built irrigation systems, they also mapped terrain. When doctors arrived to offer medical aid, they assessed local sentiment and leadership structures. Mossad turned soft power into spycraft. But as the 1970s dawned, the facade began to crack. The Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo shifted global loyalties. Many African states, pressured by the Arab League and economic dependencies, cut ties with Israel. Embassies closed, advisors were withdrawn, and the development programs disappeared overnight. Yet Mossad refused to vanish. Beneath the surface, its networks continued, thinner, quieter, but alive. Agents remained under commercial covers, gathering intelligence and maintaining contacts with loyal African officers who valued past cooperation. This dual reality, official isolation but clandestine presence, became the essence of Mossad's hidden war in Africa. The agency no longer sought recognition, it sought reach. Its operations became darker and riskier, relying on covert funding and deep cover agents posing as businessmen, pilots, and researchers. Africa had become a continent of ghosts, and Mossad was among the most experienced ghosts of all. The story that began with cooperation was now evolving into survival. The agency had entered a new phase, one where every ally could turn overnight, every favor could carry a hidden price, and every handshake could hide a betrayal. But for Mossad, this was nothing new. In their view, Africa was the mirror of the Middle East, unpredictable, fragmented, and forever shifting beneath the surface. And so as those C-130s thundered toward Entebbe that night in 1976, they weren't just carrying commandos and courage. They carried the accumulated years of invisible groundwork, secret alliances and silent sacrifices that stretched back to Mossad's first footprint on African soil. That's the unseen story, the invisible hand that moved across a continent, shaping history without ever showing its face. The 1970s reshaped Africa, and in those shifting sands, Mossad's hidden war reached its most dangerous phase. What had begun as a campaign of friendship and training was now a labyrinth of betrayals, assassinations, and covert deals. Officially, Israel's presence on the continent had shrunk to almost nothing. In reality, Mossad's reach had never been deeper. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Arab League's oil embargo changed everything. African economies, reliant on Arab aid and petroleum, were forced to pick sides. One by one, over 20 African nations severed diplomatic ties with Israel. Embassies were shuttered, advisors expelled, and Mossad's field officers ordered home. But inside the organization's Tel Aviv headquarters, withdrawal was never an option. Instead, a new directive emerged: operate without a flag. Mossad shifted from open diplomacy to shadow diplomacy. Front companies replaced embassies. Agricultural consultants, aviation engineers, mining investors. These became the covers for intelligence operatives who maintained contact with trusted African partners. The official mission was gone, but the networks built over a decade couldn't be dismantled overnight. For Mossad, these contacts were gold, connections that reached deep into military units, airfields, and political offices across East, West, and Central Africa. In Ethiopia, the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie and the rise of the Derg regime in 1974 threatened to erase everything Mossad had built. The Marxist junta turned toward the Soviet Union, and Soviet advisors soon filled Addis Ababa's air bases. Yet Mossad managed to keep a lifeline open through the remnants of the Ethiopian intelligence service and certain officers who had trained under Israeli guidance. These officers continued to feed information discreetly, not out of loyalty to Israel, but because intelligence was a currency, and Mossad always paid well. At the same time, Israel faced a new problem. Sudan had become a transit point for weapons flowing from Libya and Egypt to Palestinian factions. Intelligence reports spoke of training camps deep in the desert, guarded by local militias. Mossad operatives disguised as European businessmen began appearing in Khartoum and Port Sudan, mapping routes, monitoring airfields, and intercepting radio traffic. Sudan became both a listening post and a chessboard. And in the middle of that board, Mossad's agents clashed with Arab and Soviet intelligence in a quiet, invisible war. In Kenya, Mossad found one of its last open allies. Nairobi remained a discreet operational base for surveillance and logistics, particularly after Uganda fell into Amin's hands. It was from Kenyan territory that Israeli intelligence kept eyes on the Red Sea, Yemen, and Somalia. Kenyan intelligence officers, trained in earlier Israeli programs, continued to share data in exchange for technology and weapons. These alliances were unspoken, but they were vital, especially when Mossad began tracking Arab cargo ships suspected of carrying arms to militant groups. Meanwhile, in Zaire, Mobutu's paranoia made him both an asset and a liability. He relied on Mossad to secure his regime, using Israeli equipment and tactics to protect his palaces and monitor political rivals. But he also flirted with Arab powers for funding, forcing Mossad to balance loyalty with manipulation. The agency supplied intelligence on rebel movements in exchange for access to Mobutu's inner circle, a relationship built on mutual mistrust and necessity. Behind the smiles and handshakes lay a battlefield of secrets. It was during these years that Mossad perfected one of its most effective strategies: proxy infiltration. Instead of sending Israeli operatives directly into hostile countries, the agency recruited Africans, officers, traders, journalists, who could move freely across borders without suspicion. These local assets provided information, smuggled equipment, and even conducted sabotage operations. Mossad's hand rarely appeared, but its influence lingered in unexpected places. A radar system malfunctioning in Sudan, a warehouse burning in Mogadishu, a suspicious car accident in Chad. One of the most daring examples came in Eritrea, then still a war zone. When rebel forces fighting Ethiopia's Derg regime began to gain ground, Mossad established covert links through third-party intermediaries, hoping to monitor Red Sea shipping routes and Soviet naval activity. Israeli operatives posed as humanitarian workers and shipping agents, feeding intelligence back to Tel Aviv. The information gathered there helped map Soviet maritime presence from the Gulf of Aden to the Horn of Africa, a crucial advantage during the late Cold War. But Mossad's Africa policy wasn't just about surveillance, it was also about rescue. Quietly, under the cover of humanitarian work, the agency orchestrated one of its most secret operations: the evacuation of Jewish communities trapped in conflict zones. From the refugee camps of Sudan to the mountains of Ethiopia, Mossad officers and local agents smuggled families across borders, sometimes disguised as famine relief workers. Each mission blended compassion and espionage, saving lives while gathering intelligence. These operations later evolved into the legendary airlifts of Ethiopian Jews to Israel, but their origins lay in the same dark corridors of African spycraft. By the late 1970s, Mossad's hidden web stretched across nearly every corner of the continent. But with reach came risk. Arab intelligence agencies, particularly Libya's and Egypt's, began targeting Mossad's local assets. One after another, networks were compromised. In 1978, a Mossad operative posing as a shipping manager vanished in Dakar, Senegal, believed to have been captured and executed by Libyan agents. In Khartoum, a safe house was raided. Its contents, radios, maps, and false passports, made international headlines. Mossad denied involvement, but the damage was done. Still, the agency adapted. Rather than relying on centralized networks, it adopted a cell structure. Small, isolated units with no knowledge of each other. Even if one cell was exposed, the others would survive. The method proved so effective that it became a model for future intelligence operations worldwide. One of Mossad's senior strategists described Africa during those years as the arena of mirrors. Everyone spied on everyone, sometimes through the same intermediaries. The CIA shared intelligence with Israel. Israel traded information with African regimes that secretly passed some of it to the Soviets. Lines blurred. Loyalties shifted overnight. What mattered was not ideology, but leverage. And in that chaos, Mossad thrived. Nimble, patient, unseen. Yet, Africa also became a testing ground for black operations. Missions that stretched the limits of legality and morality. In Central Africa, Mossad allegedly facilitated arms transfers to groups opposed to Soviet-backed regimes. Officially, these were private business deals. In truth, they were part of Tel Aviv's broader campaign to limit Soviet influence. Some of those weapons later reappeared in conflicts Israel publicly condemned. A moral paradox that haunted even Mossad's own officers. Behind the curtain, Mossad's African work began to influence Israel's entire intelligence philosophy. The lessons learned in Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan would later shape how Israel conducted covert wars across the Middle East and beyond. Africa had taught Mossad that the most valuable weapon wasn't firepower. It was access. Access to information, to decision-makers, to hearts and fears. And access could be won not only through force, but through familiarity, respect, and manipulation. But as the decade closed, a storm was coming. The alliances Mossad had built were collapsing under global pressure. The United Nations had passed a resolution equating Zionism with racism, isolating Israel diplomatically. African governments that had once relied on Israeli aid now publicly condemned it to appease Arab benefactors. Mossad found itself cornered, unwelcome in the very lands it had helped stabilize, and yet it never left. Beneath the diplomatic noise, the ghost networks remained alive. Invisible arteries of intelligence linking Tel Aviv to Nairobi, Kinshasa, and Addis Ababa. Operatives used commercial covers so convincing that even allied intelligence services sometimes mistook them for genuine businessmen. The agency learned to operate entirely in the shadows, blending espionage with trade, diplomacy with deception. By the dawn of the 1980s, Mossad's hidden empire in Africa had become one of the most sophisticated intelligence ecosystems on the planet, but also one of the most fragile. The seeds of its eventual exposure had already been planted. Double agents, shifting loyalties, and the rise of radical movements that neither Israel nor its Western allies fully understood. The continent that once promised opportunity now promised peril. Mossad had built its legacy on silence, but in the coming years, silence would no longer be enough. The ghosts would have to fight to survive. The 1980s marked the bloodiest and most secretive decade of Mossad's operations in Africa, an era when the agency shifted from silent observation to direct intervention. It was a time when politics, business, and assassination blurred into one continuum. The old partnerships of the 1960s had died with the coups that swept across Africa. What remained were shadows, and Mossad knew how to live in them. After years of diplomatic isolation, Israel had turned Africa into a silent battlefield of influence. The official embassies were gone, but the covert networks remained. Mossad was no longer pretending to be a friend. It had become a ghost moving between factions, dictators, and arms dealers, whoever could serve Israel's strategic purpose. Its priority was clear: prevent Arab states and Iran from using Africa as a corridor to funnel weapons and money to militant groups hostile to Israel. The agency's operatives began mapping this new threat, tracing shipments through Sudan, Eritrea, Chad, and the Horn of Africa. Each discovery led deeper into a web of covert alliances between Middle Eastern financiers, African warlords, and European intermediaries. By 1983, intelligence pointed to a growing arms pipeline from Libya through Sudan, heading toward Palestinian factions. The Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was aggressively spreading influence across Africa, funding insurgencies and militias under the banner of anti-imperialism. To Mossad, Gaddafi's Africa strategy was more than ideology. It was a backdoor assault on Israel. So, the agency acted. Disguised Israeli operatives, posing as Western contractors, reappeared in Khartoum and Port Sudan. Their mission was to track Libyan couriers and intercept shipments headed north. Reports of mysterious explosions near warehouses and airstrips soon followed. No one claimed responsibility, but Mossad's fingerprints were invisible only to those who didn't know where to look. While Sudan became a zone of sabotage, Ethiopia turned into a zone of espionage. The fall of the Dreg regime's stability and the emergence of rebel groups gave Mossad a chance to reinsert itself quietly. Under the cover of humanitarian work and famine relief, particularly during the Great Famine of 1984-85, Israeli agents re-established networks under NGOs and international agencies. Their dual role was simple: aid by day, intelligence by night. The famine created chaos, and chaos was cover. Mossad used the opportunity to extract hundreds of Ethiopian Jews, Beta Israel, smuggling them from refugee camps in Sudan to clandestine airstrips. The world would later learn of Operation Moses, but few realized how deeply embedded Mossad operatives had become in the region during its planning. They bribed local officials, forged paperwork, and coordinated logistics with the Sudanese military, all under the noses of both Arab and Soviet intelligence. That mission, heroic as it seemed, also had another dimension. The intelligence gathered during it provided Mossad with maps of Sudanese infrastructure, air routes, and smuggling networks that would become vital in later operations. Every humanitarian route was also a surveillance route. Further south, South Africa was descending into turmoil. International sanctions had isolated Pretoria's apartheid regime, but behind the scenes, Israel saw opportunity. Both nations were under pressure. Both viewed the Soviet bloc as an existential threat, and both needed technology. The cooperation that developed between them, quietly supported by Mossad, became one of the strangest partnerships in espionage history. Under the radar, Israel provided weapons technology and training to South Africa in exchange for uranium and intelligence access. Mossad agents trained South African commandos in counterterrorism tactics and surveillance. In return, the South African Intelligence Service shared information about Libyan and Palestinian activities on the continent. It was a morally gray alliance, born not of friendship, but survival. At the same time, Mossad ran smaller but equally dangerous operations in Uganda, Kenya, and Zaire. Each country had its own secret purpose. In Uganda, Israeli intelligence quietly built connections within the army after Idi Amin's fall, determined never again to be blindsided by a hostile regime on the Nile. In Kenya, Nairobi's airports and ports became hubs for Mossad's regional logistics, communications intercepts, safe houses, and cover operations. And in Zaire, Mobutu's paranoia once again became a tool for Tel Aviv. His personal security forces received training and surveillance equipment through intermediaries linked to Mossad. The agency's network of front companies expanded rapidly. Mining firms, agricultural consultants, construction groups, all serving as masks for information collection and logistics. Under the name Foreign Business, agents coordinated weapons deliveries to pro-Israeli militias, monitored Arab investments, and occasionally arranged targeted eliminations. One such elimination shocked even seasoned African operatives. In 1986, a senior Libyan intelligence courier en route to Chad vanished in the Sahara. Weeks later, his body was discovered, poisoned, his documents missing. The operation bore every hallmark of a Mossad hit: clean execution, no witnesses, and maximum confusion. The documents he carried, according to insiders, detailed Libyan funding to militant groups operating in Lebanon and Sudan. Within months, those networks began collapsing. Their leaders either disappeared or turned on one another. Yet, not every operation went as planned. In 1988, an attempt to sabotage a Libyan cargo plane suspected of transporting weapons ended in catastrophe when the explosives detonated prematurely, killing several civilians. The fallout drew condemnation from African governments, and Mossad was forced to temporarily withdraw assets from Sudan and Chad. Still, the agency didn't retreat. It simply adapted. The same year, Mossad began establishing cyber intelligence listening posts, primitive by today's standards, in East Africa. Using radio intercept technology, it monitored Soviet and Arab communications moving through Red Sea routes. This allowed Israel to anticipate arms shipments and diplomatic movements in the Horn, strengthening its regional awareness even during global isolation. Behind these missions, another motive was growing: containment of Iran. After 1979, the Iranian Revolution gave rise to a new ideological enemy. Mossad intelligence suggested that Tehran was seeking influence in Africa, particularly through Sudan and Nigeria, to gain diplomatic footholds and recruit proxies. Israeli operatives began tracing Iranian diplomats and aid projects, believing they concealed intelligence operations. What followed was a silent contest of influence. Schools, hospitals, and mosques became fronts in a new kind of ideological war. In Sudan, Mossad's operations turned even darker. By the late 1980s, Israeli intelligence had built one of its largest African networks there, part espionage, part exfiltration. Smugglers, tribal chiefs, and even Sudanese officers were on its payroll. Yet this network also became the most dangerous. Arab intelligence agencies intensified counter-operations, hunting Mossad's local assets. Several informants were captured and executed. A few Mossad operatives vanished, their names erased from records, their families told nothing. The agency's presence became so toxic that it began using double-blind handlers, agents who didn't even know they were working for Israel. Through it all, Africa became not just an operational field, but a testing ground for Israel's evolving doctrine of asymmetric warfare. The lessons Mossad learned in the jungles, deserts, and slums of Africa: infiltration, deniability, the use of third parties, later reappeared in Middle Eastern operations. Africa had taught the agency to operate without footprints, without uniforms, and sometimes without conscience. By the end of the 1980s, Mossad's networks spanned from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, stitched together through secrecy, loyalty, and fear. Every embassy closure, every coup, every collapsed government was an opportunity to reinvent its presence. It had become a continent-wide intelligence organism, adaptable, cold, and deeply embedded in the power structures of post-colonial Africa. But such expansion came at a cost. Many African leaders began to realize that the price of Mossad's protection was their sovereignty. Israeli intelligence often acted independently, conducting operations that embarrassed or endangered its hosts. The sense of partnership eroded, replaced by quiet resentment. And in some capitals, particularly Khartoum and Kinshasa, rumors began spreading. Mossad was no longer a friend, but a spy in the house. The agency could sense the shift. As the 1990s approached, Israel prepared to pivot again, this time toward formal re-engagement through diplomacy, not espionage. But the networks it had built in blood and secrecy would never fully dissolve. They would remain hidden, dormant, ready to reawaken when needed. Africa had given Mossad its reach, and taken from it the illusion of innocence. The Cold War may have ended, but for Mossad, Africa never stopped being a chessboard. As the 1990s unfolded, the agency's covert networks across the continent came alive once again. Only this time, under new names, new alliances, and new motives. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left power vacuums everywhere, and intelligence agencies scrambled to claim them. Mossad, long a veteran of such invisible wars, moved quickly to re-establish what it had built in the shadows decades earlier. The diplomatic thaw gave Israel a rare opening. African nations that once severed ties under Arab League pressure now reconsidered. Quiet emissaries from Jerusalem began visiting Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Lagos, and even Kigali. They came not as spies, but as businessmen, agricultural experts, and security consultants. Behind them, Mossad's veteran operatives returned, this time wearing suits instead of disguises. But make no mistake, the game had not changed. Only the cover stories had. The Horn of Africa remained Israel's most strategic frontier. Ethiopia, after years of Marxist rule, had fallen into turmoil. Eritrea had gained independence in 1993, and its Red Sea coastline became the focus of global intelligence interest. For Israel, access to the Red Sea meant proximity to both Sudan and Yemen, two countries with growing Iranian presence. In this volatile setting, Mossad quietly reinserted itself. Using humanitarian and development channels, agents re-established contact networks across Ethiopia and Eritrea. They helped build local intelligence capacities, trained counterterrorism units, and reactivated maritime surveillance systems under civilian covers. The mission had multiple goals: monitoring Iranian arms shipments across the Red Sea, intercepting militant routes, and preventing Hezbollah and Hamas operatives from gaining footholds in East Africa. It wasn't just about national security anymore, it was about preemption. Mossad had learned from the 1980s that waiting until the threat reached Israel's borders was a mistake. Africa offered the perfect stage for preventive action. In Sudan, Mossad's operations reached their peak in the early 2000s. The country had become a transit hub for Iranian weapons headed toward Gaza. Mossad, working with Israeli military intelligence, Amman, launched a series of covert strikes on Sudanese soil, targeting convoys, warehouses, and smuggling routes. Between 2009 and 2012, mysterious explosions rocked Khartoum's outskirts and the eastern deserts. One such strike destroyed the Yarmouk weapons factory, allegedly producing Iranian rockets. Sudan blamed Israel. Israel remained silent. The silence that often speaks louder than confession. At the same time, Mossad used Sudan as an intelligence laboratory. It collected data on smuggling networks stretching through Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, mapping every route, informant, and middleman. The results of these operations directly shaped Israel's later border defense strategies and its covert operations against Hamas, Sarit, supply lines. Farther west, the chaos of Rwanda and Congo in the 1990s, offered Mossad both challenge and opportunity. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 horrified the world, but few noticed how quickly Israel reappeared afterward. Under humanitarian pretexts, Israeli security experts trained Rwandan and Ugandan units in post-conflict stabilization. Officially, these efforts were part of rebuilding African peacekeeping capacities. Unofficially, they allowed Mossad to monitor French and Iranian activities in the region. In Zaire, later the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mobutu's regime crumbled, but remnants of Mossad's old contacts remained alive. Former military liaisons, businessmen, and intelligence intermediaries provided valuable eyes and ears on resource deals and mercenary activity. The diamond trade in particular attracted Mossad's attention, not for profit, but for its link to global money laundering channels used by militant financiers. The agency also learned from Africa's corporate intelligence world. Israeli private security firms, often staffed by ex-Mossad and IDF veterans, began operating across the continent in the 1990s and early 2000s. These companies, specializing in counterterrorism training, risk analysis, and surveillance technology, blurred the line between national intelligence and private enterprise. For Mossad, they became deniable assets. Through them, Israel could project influence, collect intelligence, and build alliances without official footprints. After 9/11, everything changed. The United States declared its war on terror, and suddenly, Israel's decades of counterterrorism experience were in demand. Mossad found itself working more openly with the CIA and MI6, but Africa remained the back room where sensitive operations could unfold away from public scrutiny. In Kenya, Israeli agents became instrumental in foiling al-Qaeda plots. After the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, Mossad helped identify and track the masterminds responsible. In 2002, when terrorists targeted an Israeli-owned hotel and attempted to shoot down an Israeli plane in Mombasa, Mossad's presence intensified. Counter-terrorism cooperation between Nairobi and Tel Aviv deepened, resulting in a permanent security partnership that continues to this day. In Ethiopia, Mossad's influence expanded again under counter-terrorism frameworks. It worked alongside Ethiopian intelligence to monitor movements across the Somali border, where extremist groups like al-Shabaab were emerging. Israeli technology, drones, surveillance systems, cyber capabilities, became part of East Africa's security architecture. But this partnership came with quiet controversy. Some African governments began questioning the long-term price of Mossad's involvement. Intelligence sharing, while beneficial against terror threats, often tilted power toward regimes known for human rights abuses. Israeli advisors were accused of indirectly enabling repression in exchange for strategic cooperation. For Mossad, moral ambiguity was part of the terrain. Its guiding logic was always utilitarian: stability first, ethics later. By the late 2000s, the Israeli-Iranian shadow war reached deep into Africa. Mossad intelligence indicated that Iran had begun establishing networks to move weapons through Sudan into Egypt's Sinai, a lifeline to Gaza's militant groups. This triggered one of Mossad's most aggressive covert campaigns in decades. Unmanned drones, airstrikes, and targeted eliminations became common tools. In one infamous case, a senior Hamas arms smuggler, Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, was assassinated in Dubai in 2010, but his weapons route had originated in Sudan. Mossad's footprint stretched from Khartoum's desert roads to hotel corridors thousands of miles away. At the same time, Mossad began cultivating South Sudan, which gained independence in 2011. Israeli advisors and security firms poured in, offering surveillance technology, communication systems, and training. The new country's location, bordering both Sudan and Ethiopia, made it a perfect forward base for intelligence gathering in the Nile region. Once again, Africa's fractured politics became Israel's camouflage. By the 2010s, Mossad's war in Africa evolved from field operations to digital dominance. The agency invested heavily in cyber and signals intelligence across the continent. Through Israeli tech exports, cybersecurity, spyware, drones, Mossad indirectly expanded its reach. Companies like NSO Group, makers of the controversial Pegasus spyware, became extensions of Israeli intelligence philosophy: total information control anywhere in the world. African states became both clients and subjects of this ecosystem. Governments purchased surveillance software from Israeli firms, often unaware that Mossad used such deals to map communication networks, gather metadata, and identify local threats or opportunities. Even as Israel normalized relations with several Arab countries through the Abraham Accords, Mossad maintained its African networks quietly. Sudan's 2020 normalization deal was not only a diplomatic victory, but also the culmination of decades of covert groundwork. Behind the handshake were years of sabotage, strikes, and secret negotiations shaped by Mossad's invisible hand. Today, Mossad's presence in Africa operates under layers of deniability. Officially, Israel's ties with African nations focus on agriculture, technology, and humanitarian aid. Unofficially, these relationships remain intelligence pipelines. From Sahel surveillance to Red Sea monitoring, Mossad continues to watch, listen, and influence. But the cost of this hidden war is not forgotten. Many Africans view Israel's intelligence footprint with suspicion, seeing it as an extension of Western interventionism. Others, particularly in East Africa, see it as a necessary shield against extremism. In truth, both perspectives are correct. Mossad's African legacy is a paradox of protection and manipulation, of partnership and betrayal. What began as a post-colonial alliance in the 1950s had evolved into one of the most complex intelligence engagements of the modern era. Africa taught Mossad flexibility, deniability, and survival. Lessons it would carry into every future operation from Tehran to Beirut. Africa was never just another battleground for Mossad. It was a classroom, one where the agency learned how to turn isolation into opportunity and chaos into cover. From Ethiopia's mountains to Sudan's deserts, from secret airstrips to corporate boardrooms, Mossad waged wars that never made headlines but shaped Israel's global reach. Even today, as Africa becomes a new arena for global competition between powers like China, Russia, and the West, Mossad remains quietly in the background, adapting, observing, and, when necessary, striking. Because in the world of intelligence, wars don't end, they only change form. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you found this story fascinating, the silent wars, the hidden alliances, and the betrayals buried in Africa's red dust, stay tuned for the next episode of Spy Wars Declassified, because every secret has a sequel.